Today we're going to be talking about exploiting the Vita Carnis Creatures. Yes, I'm going to be talking about it into a sock, however, I am not going to go into detail as to why. So, to start off, I guess we'll go in order of the Vita Carnis Creatures. We'll start with the crawl. Now, the crawl is a viney, is similar to the small intestines, and is kind of like a reddish tinge, and it essentially grows anywhere in the world. How can one exploit the crawl? Well, first of all, because it is abundant essentially everywhere, that means it is available to anyone. There are two ways someone could exploit this on a mass scale. One, being used for food for livestock, just because it is very abundant everywhere and it's essentially easy to grow. That means it can be fed to livestock and essentially be extremely cheap for livestock to consume. So that would be one way to exploit it. Another way would be using it for human consumption. And, well, no one would probably be interested in that type of stuff. However, if you're a little bit dodgy with the law, you can just sneak it in and call it an unnamed meat or mix it with other meats. God knows what's in salami, and therefore you can essentially chuck it into any type of meat. Second on the list is the trimmings. Now, the trimmings in the Vita Carnis universe are actually kind of used as pets. So there is the benefit of you could start either mass producing by using crawl to start selling, but other than selling them, you could mass produce them and also slaughter them and sell them for just the same as the crawl, but there's probably a little bit more protein in the trimming, so therefore you could start selling that stuff towards bodybuilders and stuff like that, and just putting it into like protein powder and just leaving it as a unlisted protein source. Then there is the mimics. Now, mimics the only possible thing that I could see mimics being used for is for military use. And what that essentially means is if you were to create a company and be the only company in your country that provides this service, you ask what service? Well, the service is using mimics as assassination tools or just as a hysteria tool. So you got to collect mimics. It would be hard, but it's probably doable. Especially when there's money in mind, anything's possible. And therefore, what you do is you say to a military, you say, hey, look, you want to cause some issues in this country and not be the cause of it? Just chuck some mimics in there and there you go. Hey, presto. That city is essentially in ruins. So now we move on to the host of influence. Now, what can you do with the host of influence? Well, same with the mimic. You could use them for military purposes. So you could essentially just grab them up, drop them somewhere, and wreak havoc. The host of influence has also been shown that you are able to collect its spores. You could use spores for nefarious intent. That could be like terrorist organizations. You could get really fancy with it, and you know how cars have tolls? You cross this bridge, you got to pay some money. You just make it so that if people walk in a certain area, they have to pay money, and therefore you can make money that way. What I could also see the spores being used for is cross-country trade. So what you do is you have a host of influence that's set up, let's say, for example, in Canada, and you have another host of influence in Australia. And what you do is you can trade with someone in trade and say, here is some spores from Canada. So if you give it to people in Australia, they aren't going to make it. And then therefore, you could do a lot of crowd manipulation. It would be crazy, the type of stuff that you could use that for. You could use spores of influence to create the perception of crowds. If you had like a bad politician and you were like their PR person, what you could do is you could use the host of influence to get those people to essentially look like there's a crowd supporting these people. It would be a little bit hard, but that way, like, you could essentially amass a lot of people in a certain area. You could essentially use it as like a public relations type thing. Onto the monoliths. I kind of struggled to come up with a way to exploit monoliths. These things are massive and there's not much known about it. However, what you could do with monoliths, you could use monoliths as a tourist site and get people to come and pay you to show them around these big fucking creatures. I don't know who would do that, but I'm sure there are people out in the world that would do that. Now, finally, is the meat snake. Now, the meat snake, it's already kind of described how people use it, and it's for disposal. However, to monetize that, to exploit that, a person could basically mass produce snakes because they self-replicate, and you could essentially create your own company selling them, or you sell them to the government and the government can give them out to people, or however it needs to go. So yeah, essentially that is the perfect way to exploit all of the creatures in Vita Carnis. If you haven't already, go check out my mimic video where I talk about if you would survive a world with mimics in it.